This is the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. Andy Payton is the lead pastor at Methodist Temple United Methodist Church in Evansville, Indiana. Randy Moore is associate pastor at Methodist Temple. Their goal is to see Christ in everything and everyone.
Welcome into the podcast, everybody. It's so good to have you. I'm Pastor Randy Moore, the associate pastor here at Methodist Temple, joined as always by the senior pastor here, the lead pastor, Pastor Andy Payton. We're right in the thick of Advent, otherwise known as the Christmas season. How's it going?
Going well. I'm actually working on my Christmas Eve homily sermon, and I also have enough together for my sermon this Sunday, so I'm dangerous at this point. Looking forward to it, though.
In my schooling, I heard of preachers who work like 2 years in advance or a year in advance or 6 months in advance. And if you're working 2 or 3 weeks in advance, you're way beyond me because I work, I take them week to week. Now, maybe I'm retiring at the end of the year, so maybe that will change.
I try to find the themes. Like, I'll find themes, but I won't develop it until we get closer to the time because I don't know, I like to work on it so it's fresh in my mind and those kinds of things. I always have a hard time when I have this like scripted thing that I've come up with 6 months ago. It just doesn't feel alive to me for whatever reason.
We have to be open to what's going on today.
Right.
And so if you plan something 2 years in advance, what it looks like today and what it'll look like in 2 years is a totally different thing, even though it's wise to, prepare.
Think ahead. Yeah. That's something I could do a lot better. I mean, I wish I could do better at that, but anyway.
Well, we're in the season of Advent, and I think it's always tricky. We've talked about this before, but we might want to start right there. It is preparation for Christmas in a sense, but it's his own thing, too, that really has to be appreciated. What is it, do you think, that makes Advent more than just preparation for Christmas?
Well, I mean, I think Advent is bigger than just Christmas celebration because these 4 weeks, at least for me, what I've noticed this year is they lay the foundation of the faith. You kind of go back to the basics during Advent. It's the beginning of the Christian year. It lays the foundation. It talks about here's what matters the most, and here's where you build from as you move into the rest of the Christian year. And so really, if you don't take Advent seriously, you dismiss the kind of themes that we talk about during this time of year. If you're not careful, you miss the whole foundation, right? I mean, and that's the tendency we all have. We try to jump ahead to Christmas and we miss the important parts that are essential, really, if we're going to navigate the journey ahead.
Yeah, and there's a blending, of course, of the liturgical calendar and the cultural calendar. It would not be wise to just separate the two and say, we pay no attention to the cultural Christmas. No, we incorporate that. And so but it does make it a little bit more difficult to make sure Advent can be Advent and not just that time of preparation for Christmas.
And the closer we get, the harder it gets.
Right.
I mean, I'll have to look and see what we're going to sing on Sunday, but I'm going to, dare I say, it's not going to be Advent type songs. It's all going to be Christmas by the time we get to the Sunday before Christmas, and that's okay. But I love, again, we've talked about this in the podcast, I love the liturgical calendar. I love the theological themes that it brings up again and again. It helps us to stay grounded, and that's something we all need to do.
Okay, so we are in the third. This Sunday will be the third Sunday in Advent. So we just came out of the second. Wait a minute, did we just do the third? Yeah, we did. Yeah, we just did the third. Yeah. Okay, we're doing this on the middle of the week, looking back and looking forward. We just did the third. That's right, because John the Baptist makes his second appearance, which is what I was going to say. Advent is about the comings of the Christ, the final coming, the coming in history, and the coming in mystery even now. And I want to get into this as we open this text today a little bit. I'm going to steal your thunder, but it's okay. It's so good. I just wanted to hit on it in the beginning. So anyway, John the Baptist gets the second Sunday and the third Sunday in Advent.
It kind of switches around a little bit.
Yeah.
But I mean, this year was definitely two.
Yeah. And so your text for last Sunday's sermon, the third Sunday in Advent, was Luke 3:15-18. I'll read it. As the people were filled with expectation and all were questioning in their hearts concerning John whether he might be the Messiah, John answered all of them by saying, I baptize you with water, but one who is more powerful than I is coming. I'm not worthy to untie the strap of his sandals. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. His winnowing fork is in his hand to clear his threshing floor and to gather the wheat into his granary, but the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire. So with many other exhortations, he proclaimed the good news to the people. And the thing that I wanted to draw out right here in the beginning is something that really hit me this time, and that's this word expectation. Mm-hmm. As the people were filled with expectation. I think that's closely related to faith itself. You know, faith has an expectation that God's going to do something. Mm-hmm. I like that a lot. And they were expecting a Messiah. And they thought, wait, is it John? We know the Messiah is coming. A Messiah has been promised. So that for me, maybe not for anybody else, but this time, for me, man, that really struck a chord.
Well, if you look at all the lessons, you're right. They all point towards expectation. And if you just look at them side by side, you might think all four of the lessons for the lectionary that are assigned for this particular Sunday, you might think, well, what do they have to do with one another? Because it's kind of hard sometimes. But if you look closely, these passages have themes of joy, but also, like you're saying, expectation. I mean, Advent is this time in which another word could be anticipate. We anticipate something's going to happen. We expect God is going to do something. Absolutely.
Well, and joy is part of that, right? Expectation doesn't mean it's not, well, it does mean it's not there yet, but there's a certainty that what's expected will come, and in that even is joy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you were talking about the coming of Christ and the coming of Christmas, the coming of Jesus, another phrase that I'll use sometimes is it also can be described as the appearance of Christ, the appearance of Jesus, the appearance of Christmas. And what I mean by that is God's always with us. There's just sometimes that God will appear in maybe a new and a fresh way. And that's kind of a way to think about it as well. Now, I'm not trying to dismiss all the eschatological type of things where we talk about the fulfillment and the end of the world, those kinds of things, which are tied into Advent. But a helpful, practical way for me to think of it is like, okay, well, where is Christ appearing in a new way for me right now? I expect that's going to happen. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, and you opened your message by saying God's on the move and is going to do something, and right away you went to the joy book in the Bible, Philippians, because in the third Sunday of Advent we light the candle of joy, and Philippians 4:4-5 says, "Rejoice." There's the word joy. "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near." That's key. The Lord is near. Expected, yes, but already near. Mm-hmm. Already close by.
Yeah, and again, I mean, when we're talking about joy here, it's different than happiness. I talked about that in my sermon, and in our culture today, when we think of joy, it's a synonym. I'm happy. I've experienced what I wanted out of life. In the sermon, the image I used was like the wheel of fortune. We spin the wheel of our lives, and if it lands in the right place, I have joy. If it spins and it goes in the wrong place, there's sadness. I'm no longer joyful. No. That's not the type of joy that Paul's talking about here. Notice he says, don't rejoice in it all became the way I wanted it to. No. I rejoice in the Lord. I rejoice in God's presence. We're talking about a different type of joy that doesn't come and go. It's not there sometimes and gone the next. No. God's always with us. And so this is a steady type of joy. And the historical context of Philippians really helps to see this because, Paul was in prison. He was awaiting his possible execution when he writes Philippians, which is arguably the most joyful document in all the New Testament. And it's just all over the place, joy everywhere in that letter. And particularly in this passage, we rejoice in the Lord because the Lord is near. We trust in God. That's where we find our joy.
Yeah, Paul himself is an object lesson in the fact that joy is not circumstantial. It's something deeper than that. There he is sitting in prison. You said that joy is a choice. That's interesting. I want you to delve into that a little more. How is joy a choice?
Okay. Well, we can choose to be aware of God's presence. Even at this moment, we can choose to be aware of that presence. God's presence is never not here with us. The sheer fact that we're here and alive means that God is loving us into existence. Now, we tune out of that presence. We forget about that presence. But when I say joy is a choice, I can, or you can, or anyone can really, I can choose to become aware of God's presence. Just after Paul says, rejoice in the Lord always, the interesting thing to me is right after that statement, really that command, he goes on in verses 6 and 7, and he says, pray. He says, okay, so how do you do it? Well, you pray. You let your request be made known to God with thanksgiving. And then he goes on into, and as we do this, the peace of God will guard our hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. That's what continues on past that passage we started with. And again, it carries this idea of a choice all throughout. But as I thought about my sermon, Randy, afterwards, and a lot of times what happens to me is I'll preach something, and then I'll go home, I'll drive home from church, and I'll think, oh, well, this is what I was trying to say. And I had one of those moments this past Sunday. I think the way I would choose to talk about joy now is that spiritual joy at the end of the day is like, it's a gratitude that's grounded in faith. That's really what spiritual joy is. It's a gratitude that's grounded and guided by faith. So let me just unpack that really quickly. We're on a journey not of our own creation. Paul was on a journey not of his own creation. Randy, you and I are on a journey not of our own creation. And I know we don't like to think about it that way in our individualism in the Western world. We're uncomfortable with this idea. But if you just stop and we just think about our lives, it's clear that there's something else happening here, guiding us, making some choices for us along the way. And so when I say joy is a gratitude grounded in faith, I'm aware that I'm a part of a bigger story and a bigger presence. And then when I choose gratitude, what I'm saying is I'm going to choose things to be grateful for that I believe God has sent my way. And I'm claiming those gifts as a way to acknowledge that, I am being guided along this journey, along this way. I feel like that's it. That's what I'm trying to say. And a helpful practice really is just to sit down at the end of the day and think about, the events of one's day. Mm-hmm. And just think through like, okay, what went well? What were the gifts? Another thing we can think about is, what's bothering me? What's God calling me to change? This is a practice that can help us cultivate a sense of spiritual joy. Here's the catch. The opposite of spiritual joy is, I wouldn't say it's sadness or depression. I would say when we lose a sense of what I'm trying to talk about here, really what happens is we begin to burn out, and we also get bored because we begin to struggle to find meaning in our lives. And I think that's another thing that should be stated. And burnout when it comes to the faith is obviously a big problem the church is experiencing right now because in our Western world, church attendance is not what it used to be, and people are not as engaged as it used to be. And so I think this particular Sunday is so relevant to what's happening in the life of the church today.
In my Sunday school class on Sunday, I don't know what brought it up necessarily, but there was a question about the Spirit and when did the Spirit first appear, because it almost sounds like, Jesus in the Gospel of John breathed the Spirit on his disciples, and then, Luke Acts, in Acts, the Spirit comes at Pentecost, and then, what is this? Was this something new? And I said, no, the Spirit's always been along. This is kind of a new manifestation of it. But it is so important, and I think what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, part of what you're saying is that the burnout is the result of trying to do something that may be something that needs to be done, but it's done on your own power and not on the power of the Spirit. Mm-hmm. And that's a prescription for burnout.
Right.
And the other thing I was thinking about as you were talking about prayer was, we might even define prayer as practicing the presence. If someone's praying, well, they're praying to someone. That's God through the Spirit. That's practicing the presence. You couldn't pray without having a well, you could. I mean, you could just mouth words. Mm-hmm. But if you're praying, you're practicing the presence, and you're in the presence of the Spirit.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to talk about it. I agree. Yeah. People do a lot of good things in the world today, and I celebrate that. They are signs of God's presence and love. Any sort of kindness, generosity, any of that, I believe, are echoes of the one love that made it possible. Don't get me wrong. But what happens is, and this, you hit it well. I mean, exactly. What happens is we'll set off on this path like, I'm going to go be a good person. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be a generous person. We go try to do these things. I want to cheer that on. Don't get me wrong. But what inevitably will happen is you'll get kind of tired and worn down. And then if we're not careful, resentful, because the gifts that we tried to share were not received in the way that we wanted them to be received. I mean, you could just see that over and over again. And one of the worst ways that can happen is, in terms of the faith, is a person is walking through the motions of their faith, but they've lost their joy. Mm-hmm. And really what I'm talking about there is their enthusiasm and their passion and excitement for the faith. I feel like one of the biggest harms to the witness of the faith is someone walking through the motions, but they're not excited to do it. I mean, unfortunately, we've all seen people do that. And a lot of times when we'll see something like that, there's something in us that says, thanks, but no thanks, I don't need that. And so cultivating this idea of joy is critically important.
It's critically important for pastors as well. And the church recognizes that. We've talked about this a few times on the podcast. I really do think that the church, the United Methodist Church, I really do think that they prioritize the spiritual health of their pastors. Now, can they always, come through with the resources necessary to make sure their pastors don't burn out? Not always. They're not perfect at it, but they do recognize it at least. And then at least we have a shot at some resources. And so what you and I probably ought to be about is noticing that even among the laity, there are people, as you've just described, there are people who are doing the right thing and doing the right thing who might need some spiritual resources mm-hmm. to keep going.
Mm-hmm. So to put legs to it all, keep it, mm-hmm. And to use another phrase from another part of the Bible, I think working out a Christian life without God's strength in our life is what Paul was talking about when he said the law of sin and death. We have a form of religion without the power, and that's the law of sin and death. It's gonna end us in the end if we're not careful.
And so John the Baptist, back to John the Baptist, you described him as the perfect representation of preparation, the kind of things we've been talking about already.
He's a staggering figure in terms of, every gospel talks about John the Baptist. So we know he's huge when it comes to the advent of Christ and the preparing of Christ. And he lays that foundation about how do we make space for this joy to enter in. There's a story in Luke's gospel of John's mother, Elizabeth. It's an interesting story that, we're not going to get to read this year, so we can talk about it now. But the story goes in Luke's gospel when Mother Mary learns that she's pregnant with baby Jesus, she just can't keep the secret, and so she travels to Elizabeth's house. And Elizabeth, who also has her own miraculous birth, she is pregnant with John the Baptist. And the story goes when Mary greets Elizabeth, John the Baptist, and Elizabeth leaps for joy. And that's a foreshadow of John's mission.
Yeah.
Right? What's he do? He leaps for joy because of the coming Messiah. That's his mission. And so, of course, we're going to talk about this man that leaps for the joy of the Messiah that's on the way. It's perfect in terms of the Advent season. In any case, this past week we heard again from John, and on the surface, he does not seem to be all that joyful. At least how we think about it today. He comes out pretty strong. He says, flee from the wrath to come. That's one of the lines he uses. He calls people a brood of vipers, snakes, which is not altogether positive. And then the people, of course, ask him, they said, what should we do, John? And John says, share your coat, share your food, don't abuse your position in the world, do what's right by the people. Essentially, he says, be a good and decent person, right? And we just stop right there for a moment. A kind of side note here with this. I feel like in this sermon that John's preaching, we find a picture of positive masculinity. And I went on kind of a tangent in my sermon. I'll go on a tangent again. That's something that guys are struggling with today. What does it mean to be masculine? A guy's guy. I look at John here. Here is John down by the Jordan, risking himself, confronting evil, and risking himself for that which is good. That's the picture of what positive masculinity looks like. He's not playing it safe. Let's be real. John is not a picture of self-care, right? You don't get any of that.
He wasn't so concerned about preserving his own life.
No.
Yeah.
And just let's stop here for a moment and go into like our culture. Think about the stories we tell. Who's the hero? Is the hero the one that goes on like a perpetual vacation and lays on the beach forever and says, boy, that person's wonderful. They really took care of themselves? No. The one that goes on the hero's journey is the one that risks themselves and sacrifices themselves. And that's this guy. That's John. I mean, here he is. He's at the banks of the Jordan River. He's calling people out saying, let's get it together, folks. Ultimately, John loses his life for calling out Herod for marrying his brother's wife. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's saying, no, you shouldn't do that. He was confronting evil. And so, I mean, here you go. This is your picture of masculinity and your picture of joy. John was not happy. It wasn't kumbaya, but he was joyful in God. He was joyful in who he was, John was in God, but also who we could become as well.
I like to linger on John the Baptist during Advent because, as you said, he just looms so large, and he gets credit for preparing the way for Jesus. But he did more than that. He prepared Jesus, right? He baptized Jesus. He had his own following. And wow, yeah, you can't.
And then if we kept reading in Luke's gospel, I mean, I don't have a Bible with me right in front of me, but I'm pretty sure if we kept reading, it says something like, and then after John was arrested, Jesus began his ministry. Now, Paul's again, here you go. There's some sort of big connection between Jesus and John here.
Right.
It's like Jesus says, no, I can't stop. I have to continue this mission. I have to go on. John inspires Jesus, really. The fact that he's in all the Gospels in a similar way, they all kind of have their own spin, but in a similar way of preparing, we should really pay attention.
All the Gospel writers had to deal with John the Baptist. There was no avoiding that. Okay, so I baptize you with water. The one who's coming baptizes with the Spirit. What's the difference?
Between water and the Spirit? Yeah. I would use a John Wesley quote. His great fear for the people called Methodist is that they would have a form of religion without the life-changing power. Mm-hmm. John, up to this point, has given people a form of religion, which is not bad. They ask him what to do, and he says, well, you need to do acts of justice, share your food and your coats, and do what's right. Okay, great. But he doesn't stop there. People begin to wonder if John was the Messiah or not, and then he makes it very clear, hey, I'm just baptizing you with water. That's kind of like a form of religion. But Jesus is coming. His mission is to dip you into a bigger presence and a bigger power. That's the power of the Holy Spirit. And without that Spirit, again, there's the burnout. And so for me, if you put it all together, it's perfect. I mean, faith without works is dead. We have to have both. But really what happens in this passage, in this sermon, is the two are coming together. Here's the way of life we're called to live. We're called to live a Christ-like life, but we do that by grace. We do that with God's strength and help within our lives.
And here is another place where you inserted the word expect or expectation when you said, expect God to be with you.
Yeah, expect God's going to do something.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a much different, it's just a whole different approach to the faith. There's faith as religion, which is rituals and routines, which are not bad in and of themselves, but there's faith as religion. But there's faith as religion with expectation that some things are going to happen, something's going to happen here. You're going to have them both. Mm-hmm. And And one of the signs I think that we've lost joy is we become more about the routines and the religion than the expectation. Routines and religion without the expectation, it's dry and it's dull and it's dead, and that's just not it.
Well, you had a story that you told about expectation having to do with, and the example that you used and then applied it to the church was the example of parents who expect that their children are going to be even more upwardly economically mobile than they were, and they participate in it.
Yeah, I was quoting an article from my friend Josh Claiborne, who's also a member of our church, and Josh has got some wonderful commentary on cultural things that are happening, and every so often he writes an article. But the week leading up to my sermon, he wrote an article entitled "The Fragile Dream," and it was talking about how when parents expect that their children have the capacity for upward economic mobility, when the parents have this expectation that, well, they're going to go beyond the parent, right? That there's this possibility. Then when the parent has an expectation, they're more likely to sacrifice for that child's future, put them in situations where they can learn, sacrifice for their education, these sorts of things. When that expectation is not there, then the parent is less likely to do those sorts of things. And as I read that, the pastor in me, of course, thought, well, this is kind of like the spiritual life. When the expectation is there, you're enthusiastic, we're passionate about our journey with God and the possibilities of what God's going to do. We're willing to sacrifice ourselves to make that happen. We want to do it. Versus when it's not there, well, as I just noted, it's dry and it's dull and it's dead. It's less than inspiring. And so having that expectation is so critical in terms of keeping it going.
You had a couple of other stories. I don't know if you wanted to insert those here, but you referenced a hospital visit that you made and then a church outing to see a movie.
Yeah. I don't know. I can tell stories. I was really inspired by a guy I went to see at the hospital recently. I got permission from his family. I said, hey, can I tell that story? Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Please tell that story. And his name was...
That's why I wanted to make sure you had the clear... Yeah.
Yeah, I did. I asked. And his name's Gary, and he is a retired Episcopalian priest. He's the father of our choir director. And he was in the hospital over Thanksgiving and having some complications. So he had to sit it out, right? I mean, during the holiday, which is hard. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't sure what I was going to get myself into when I went to see him. But as I walked in the room, here was this beacon of joy. Mm-hmm. I said, Gary, how you doing? Oh, I'm pretty good, actually. This has been a great opportunity to, how did he say it? Exercise the gift of faith. And I thought, wow. And then I watched him exercise the gift of faith. Every person that entered the room, they were touched by Gary's gratitude. He knew the nurses' names. He was kind. He was thankful to them. We got to talking about his faith journey and different writers, spiritual writers that he enjoyed. Like Randy, he had actually gone to Snowmass, Colorado, and was at the, I forget the name of the place where Thomas Keating used to be. He went there.
All right.
And was telling me about Thomas Keating, who, if you don't know who that is, he was a Catholic monk who's really one of the major players in what they call the centering prayer movement, which is a form of Christian meditation. And so that's someone I really enjoy. I know, Randy, you really enjoy Thomas Keating too. And so we really clicked at that point. But the thing that really struck me, though, is he had spent his life in the way he has prayed, invested in the faith, preparing himself for this moment as he had to sit out Thanksgiving in the hospital. And what happened? Well, he was ready to exercise the gift of faith. Not what he wanted, I'm sure, but he touched everyone with gratitude and joy, even to the point where when I got to the end of our conversation and I was kind of wrapping it up, I said, Gary, why don't you just pray for me? And he did. He prayed for me. It's wonderful. But I think deep down we all want to be like that. And I think what the gospel teaches us is we can, if we choose. Mm-hmm. And it takes effort and it takes time. Don't think that happens overnight.
And you found yourself in a similar position, maybe not to the same degree, Saturday night when you couldn't sleep.
Yeah. I forgot I told that story. Yeah. So I've been thinking about Joy all week, and then Saturday night comes rolling around, and Saturday afternoon I spent the afternoon raking up the leaves in my backyard, and we just bought a new house, and the former owners had this landscaping kind of in the back, and it's really like a leaf magnet. Like a leaf falls, it will never leave. It's in that. And so I was raking leaves all afternoon. I was feeling pretty good. So then went to the garage, started cleaning out the garage. And by the time I was all done, my 45-year-old back began to kick in. And boy, it started to hurt to the point where when it came time for me to go to bed, I was having trouble sleeping. And I didn't know what else to do to get comfortable. So I just started praying. Mm-hmm. I don't want to seem too pious here. But I thought, well, Jesus he stayed up all night. What did he do? He prayed.
Right.
And I was like, well, I guess I'll pray. And because I don't have anything else to do. Mm-hmm. And so I just kind of started repeating what they call the Jesus prayer, mm-hmm. which is a prayer that goes way back to at least the 5th century. Mm-hmm. And the prayer goes, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And you kind of use that as a mantra to enter into God's presence. And I don't know how long I repeated it, but I began to find my way to what Paul talks about, that peace that surpasses all understanding. I knew that even though I was there in pain, I wasn't alone. And by golly, my back actually started getting better. I was like, this is crazy. But it's a simple story, but I think that's kind of capturing how you do it.
And your challenge at the conclusion of your sermon was repeat the sounding joy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The song of God's voice is singing throughout all of creation. Mm-hmm. And when we choose God, we choose that gratitude. Or to say what I said earlier, joy, when we choose gratitude grounded in faith, we choose that idea, makes all the difference in the world.
All right, we're coming closer and closer to Christmas. This Sunday will be the 4th Sunday in Advent. And I didn't know, how much of this text are you going to use?
I'm just going to use Mary's song.
Okay, just the Magnificat?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I think that begins in verse 46, Randy.
Yeah, and Mary said, my soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. For he has looked with favor on the lowly state of his servant. Surely from now on all generations will call me blessed. For the Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is his name. Indeed, his mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. He has come to the aid of his child Israel in remembrance of his mercy, according to the promise he made to our ancestors, to Abraham and to his descendants forever. So the sermon preview, Advent 4.
Advent 4. That's a beautiful, beautiful song. That's such a... Go back through that and look at it again. It just, holy moly. It's the culmination of the season of Advent, the story of Mary. And every year, Advent 4 is Mary. It makes complete sense that we would start talking about her right before the
birth.
The birth of Christmas, or the gift of Christ. And in the Protestant world, we struggle with the idea of Mary because of our break from the Catholic Church,
right.
And to our own peril here, because sure. She is the example and the symbol for what it means to live out the gospel. We are all called to a Mary-like journey where we carry Christ into the world. It's absolutely, when we're talking about getting back to the basics of our faith, here is the basics of our faith. We're called to sing the same song. And so this Sunday, we light the candle of love, and I'm going to talk about basically, here's the example of what that looks like. Here's Christian love. That's what it looks, Mary.
Very good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for listening. Listen, if you'd like to worship with us, maybe you don't have your own home church, we worship at 8:30, traditionally at 11 o'clock. That's our contemporary service. And then on Christmas Eve, we'll have our contemporary service at 4 and our traditional service at 7. You are more than welcome to join us. But whether you do or not, we hope that your Advent has been one that's been meaningful to you. And we do pray that you have a Merry Christmas. Thank you again for listening. We'll talk to you again next week.
This has been the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. You are welcome to join us at Methodist Temple in person or online. Methodist Temple is at 2109 Lincoln Avenue in Evansville, Indiana. Our traditional Sunday morning worship service is at 8:30 with our contemporary service at 11. Log on to our website at methodisttemple.church. We see Christ in you.